This is the fourth in a series of videos about criticisms of benefit cost analysis. And this time I'm going to focus on the criticism that you sometimes see that benefit cost analysis doesn't adequately address questions of fairness or equity. And I'm going to tackle these issues, or tackle the question of whether it does or doesn't do this through two questions. First of all, who gains? And secondly, who loses? So who gains and who loses really wraps up a lot of what people care about when they ask about equity or fairness in relation to benefit cost analysis. In part, you could answer those questions without getting into equity or fairness. You could just answer them as factual questions, just by actually quantifying who in the community gains and who in the community loses. But having answered those questions, it sort of begs two more questions. First of all, are the gainers different from the losers? And are the gainers already better off than the losers? So we'll dig into those two additional questions a bit. First of all, are the gainers different from the losers? Maybe one group in society bears most of the costs involved in the project that's being evaluated with benefit cost analysis, and a different group gains most of the benefits. And that's not particularly uncommon. There's always some disparity between the groups that pay and the groups that get the benefits. If they're too different, then that in itself could be seen as being unfair. And that sort of version of unfairness is built into things like the beneficiary pays principle. And so perhaps an organisation that's doing a project and identifies that the beneficiaries are different from the people who bear the costs, they might be prompted to try to reduce that disparity between who benefits and who loses as an act of trying to address fairness, or in fact for other reasons as well. Sometimes it's a good reason to reduce that disparity just to ensure that there is funding available to do the project. You know, the people who gain are more likely to be willing to pay. But that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking mainly about judgments about what is fair or unfair. So arguably, if the people who pay are different from the people who gain, that could be considered as unfair. Then the other question is, who out of the gainers and losers is more advantaged? Who's relatively well off before we even start? Are the gainers relatively advantaged already? Are the losers relatively disadvantaged already? And if the answers to either of those questions is yes, then that is another potential reason why the organisation that's responsible for the project might feel that this reduces the attractiveness of the project. Why would they want to do a project that benefits people who are already really well off, or which adversely affects people who are already disadvantaged? And so this is really appealing to some sort of fairness or equity rule, something like more equality of outcomes is better. So you could call that the more equality of outcomes is better principle, if you like. But it's trying to indicate what is driving these judgments about equity or fairness. Now, one of the challenges is that if you try to respond to this equity condition, trying to achieve the maximum equality of outcomes, that isn't necessarily consistent with the previous equity condition that we talked about, the beneficiary pays principle, and neither of them are necessarily consistent with other fairness or equity principles that we might come up with, such as the polluter pays principle. They all imply different things about which projects are relatively good and relatively bad. And it's not really clear or black and white or obvious or objectively the case that any one of those principles is better than any of the others as a way of deciding what's fair. So what I'm saying really is that the issue of how to pursue equity or fairness through your design of projects or the choice of which projects you fund is not a simple matter. It's really quite a complex and subtle matter, and it's really difficult to get sort of something that feels universal and broadly agreed, because inevitably what is considered fair or equitable is to some degree in the eyes of the beholder. Different people will have different views depending on where they come from, depending on whether they are being affected by the project, either positively or negatively. So, it's really not a clear-cut, straightforward thing to try and make decisions about or to try and reflect in an analysis. All right, so let's jump back to benefit cost analysis and go back to the question of, does benefit cost analysis allow for fairness? Well, if you think that the way to allow for fairness is to try and include weights in the analysis to reflect how much you think different groups in society should be benefiting from the project. So if you're trying to benefit relatively disadvantaged people, you might weight those benefits more. Then the answer is no. That benefit cost analysis, at least usually in the way that it's normally conducted, does not include an allowance for weighting the results to give more weight to benefits to some groups relative to others. Normally, by far and away the most common approach is that the main metrics that we use in benefit cost analysis to try to evaluate a project are applied to the whole project and ignore who gains or loses. So when we calculate the benefit cost ratio or the net present value, we don't usually do that for individual groups, we do it for the project as a whole. But let's talk about it in a different way. If you think that it's sufficient for benefit cost analysis to proceed in a way that doesn't explicitly give weights to outcomes for different groups, then the answer could be yes, because good benefit cost analysis practice does involve recording who gets how much of each of the benefits, who gets to pay for the costs of the project, and to report that information to decision makers as part of the report that's produced at the end of doing the benefit cost analysis. So this is really just good practice, being transparent about who benefits and who pays. And then the usual approach is just to leave it to the decision makers to judge for themselves what they want to do about that. If they see disparities or deviations from what they consider to be fair, they can build that into their judgments. And they can do that without it being built explicitly into the benefit cost ratio or to the net present value. Now, could we actually include weights in a benefit cost analysis? Is there actually, maybe that would be even better, you might be thinking, that we could avoid that sort of highly subjective thing of leaving it to the decision makers by getting weights built into the benefit cost analysis directly. This has actually been seriously proposed, and it certainly is possible to do, but in reality it's very rarely been done. There's been interest in doing it at various times, and some particular authors have advocated for it, but if you go out looking for BCAs where this has been done, they are quite hard to find. So one possible reason for that is that it's difficult to do, and you've seen already in my comments that it's very difficult to decide which equity principles you're even going to use. How will you weight them? On what basis will you weight the outcomes? You've got to decide on the basis for deciding what's fair and not fair before you get started. And that in itself is pretty difficult. So maybe it's not surprising that it hasn't often been done. But another reason why it hasn't been done might be that people have decided that it's actually not a good idea. Many economists would probably agree, and I'm probably one of them, that it's actually better not to do that. It actually hides and makes less transparent what's going on. Keeps some information a little bit submerged within the analysis so that the decision makers don't have information that they should have to make the decision. So here's a quote from the guidelines produced by the Australian government, which says that the judgments entailed in the approach, that's the approach of including weights, are almost always most appropriately made by the government at the political level. So they basically say, yes, you could include weights, but you shouldn't. You should just leave that to the political and the agency decision makers to judge. But that you should identify who the winners and losers are, how much they win and lose, and present that information as part of informing the decision makers. I'll move on now and address a couple of other issues related to fairness in projects. And one is the question of whether we should even aspire for every project to be fair. Sometimes when I've been around the table and people have been talking about, what we should be considering when we're evaluating projects, there seems to be a bit of a sentiment that we ought to consider the fairness of projects. And it's not exactly stated, but it's sort of implied that we should be trying to support those projects that are the fairest, and we should be trying to get all of our projects to be fair. Well, I've already indicated, I guess, that it may not be very clear what we mean by fair, but perhaps we mean that the project should be trying to benefit everybody equally. My response to that would be, well, that's not very practical. There are very, very few projects that benefit everyone equally. And it's probably not even desirable, because that minority of projects that benefit everyone equally are probably not the best projects. You're probably better off overall across a portfolio of projects, identifying the projects that perform best at achieving certain specialised things and optimising across the whole portfolio, rather than trying to achieve an objective with each individual project. All right, so adopting that aim that every project should try to make everybody better off will probably make everybody worse off overall, because you're missing out on the opportunity to select those projects that are especially good at delivering certain types of benefits. So that's one factor that we ought to think about. And another one is, I've been talking about weighting the outcomes to try and make a judgment about which projects should be funded. There's a case to be made, actually, though, that weighting projects is not appropriate in any case. It's not really the right way that we should be trying to achieve fairness and equity in the community as a whole. There are other mechanisms available for us to do that, which we do use. We have a welfare system. We have progressive income tax, for example, two key measures. And arguably, we should be using those mechanisms to achieve the level of equity and fairness across the community as a whole that we want. Maybe the education system is another one. So if we are judging that there isn't sufficient fairness or equity in the community, then the solution to that, arguably, would be to go to these sorts of mechanisms and beef them up, make sure that they're working as well as they can, rather than trying to use things like environmental projects or transport projects or something like that as a sort of a proxy way of achieving fairness, right? Because that's inevitably going to mean that you compromise the outcomes of those projects. So, for example, it would probably mean accepting lower environmental outcomes for the delivery of more equitably shared benefits from an environmental project. And that might look good from the perspective of an individual project, but it's probably not the best way to achieve equity overall when we consider the entire portfolio of what governments do. So in conclusion, benefit cost analysis usually doesn't include weights as a mechanism to try and increase the level of fairness coming from project investments. But it can and should document who are the gainers and who are the losers from projects and how much they gain and lose. And then the usual view of economists is that the best strategy is to leave it to the judgment of decision makers to decide how they use that information to make decisions about fairness. Okay, so if you're interested in benefit cost analysis, I'd like to encourage you to consider doing my micro-credential course on applied benefit cost analysis. This is a fully online course, which is a mixture of pre-recorded and live components. It runs over 12 weeks. It can be done as a standalone unit or as part of a master's degree. You can come into this unit with no existing economics background. A large number of students have already done this unit, and the response has been extremely positive. People have really enjoyed the course and have got a lot out of it. And if you'd like to find out more about it, then I'd encourage you to have a look at this website, appliedbca.org.